Hello and welcome to the Group A BMW M3 setup video. It's been a little while waiting for this one to come around, wanted it to be just right. If all you're interested in is the setups themselves, feel free, head off to the last minute or so of the video. You'll find setup sheets there for both rates and units depending on how you work, all at the end of the video. For those that want the detail, you probably know the format by now. We're going to go through between now and that last minute of the video details about the car and how the default setup felt, what we felt needed work, and what the car was generally like to work with. We'll then go through any weird little things we found about the car along the way before we then talk about the development process that it's been through to get to where we are now, and then we'll get into the different circuits that it's been tested at to then also help us get through this to this stage of the process. And then we'll run through the setup sheets themselves, sheet by sheet, to see how it compares to the default setup. Then we'll go through the different suggested adjustments you may or may not wish to make if you try it and maybe want it to behave slightly differently, and also adjustments to make if it's wet and that sort of stuff. Then we'll get into what's next, and then finally the setup sheets at the end for both rates and units. So, without further ado, let's get into the details about the car. With this car, I've got a bit of a personal connection. My dad used to race prepare one of these for a friend of his. His friend's no longer with us, sadly, but I used to travel up and down the country in the UK with my dad and his friend to different circuits, and yeah, so there's a lot of very fond childhood memories which are attached to this car, which is really quite cool. But that aside, current day, playing it in a game, which is really nice to be able to do that, to get a feel for what Dad's friend had. So let's get into the game itself. So the default setup actually isn't a million miles away. Its general balance is mainly nice, and it was something actually that I wanted to try and maintain as best as I could. But when you got to pushing it further towards the limits, it felt like it wasn't really using its tyres fully. It didn't really bite the way I was expecting it to into the tarmac. So I thought, well, if we can sort that out, then we should be able to make it competitive against the Merc and possibly even the Audi, which is like a step ahead of everything, really. I did feel that the car was lacking a bit of stability on throttle and had a tendency for the rear to break away approaching the apex while trail braking, and this kind of meant that the rear tyre wear was a little bit higher than I'd like on a long run compared to the front. It wasn't a balanced tyre wear, and I sort of felt it was quite clear that the focus had to be on the rear of the car. It was that was the big limiting factor, I felt. So I thought, if we can maximise the rear, we can then balance the front to suit. And I'm very pleased to report that the car was very responsive to adjustment, and it has been an absolute pleasure to work with it, and I'm absolutely gutted to put it down after this week. I would love to carry on using it for even longer. And I'm also pleased to report that with the new setup, it races really, really well now. And even if you took the setup bit away, the class now races really, really well, which I didn't really find it did before. Previously I felt like they raced a bit too, I guess in some ways a bit too realistically, but a bit too professional touring car racer, nudge up the rear corner, you're out, see you later, good night. And it wasn't a sort of style of racing that I was really pleased with. I didn't really enjoy that. I'm much more of a gentleman racer sort of style, and ideally the sort of racing you'd expect to see of the pro drivers who race at the Goodwood Revival meeting. That sort of racing is how I like, you know, where you get as close as you can without touching, and if you do touch, it's a genuine mistake sort of thing, you know. Yeah, with the recent AI changes that Reiza have made, the class races beautifully now, and I've really enjoyed racing it. And like I said, I'm really gutted to be putting it down. And I've enjoyed it so much that I actually invested the time to put my own livery on the car and put that on there and get that done. So I fully intend to race this on a more regular basis now. It's quite quickly become one of my very favourite cars I've driven in this game. So yeah, it's been a really, really good 2 and a bit weeks, and I've absolutely loved it, and I'm a little bit gutted to move on. But that's a good overview of the car, really. It's been fantastic, and I've loved it, and I think you're going to love it if you try it as well. So, with that said, there were a couple of odd little things that we came across, so let's get into those now. So while working with the car, there was a couple of things that stood out to us that we just thought were probably worthy of mention for this, especially before we talk in detail about the setup changes. It's good to have these things in the back of your mind. So Peter felt that the power delivery of the AMS2 version of this car was very aggressive compared to the Assetto Corsa version of this car. Now, I only race AMS2, that's all I use, but Peter spreads himself more widely, and he has a much better overview of the different cars in the different games. Now, just because it's different between AMS2 and AC, it doesn't necessarily mean that the AMS2 version is wrong, but the thing is that they can't both be correct, and we can't change it anyway, so we have got what we've got. Now, whether it's the AMS2 version that's right or wrong doesn't really matter, because, well, it is what it is. So the setup that we're going to give you today it's geared with that in mind. It is certainly, as I said earlier, you know, it was the rear of the car that needed focus, clearly. So that is a big part of that, was the power delivery and getting it so that you can use that aggressive power delivery, because now with the car the way that it is, it's not really much of a problem. In fact, if anything, it's a good thing. So, but it's still worthy of note, and it's good to have it up there before we get into the real detail of it. The only other detail that I noticed, which again we can't do anything about, is that the brakes run abnormally cool, especially the rears. Now, it's not the first car we've seen this with, and I believe Reiza are looking at it internally already, but it is affecting this car. But I don't honestly think it's affecting the balance of the car. I just think that it's one of the things that you can see it's a symptom on this car, but not necessarily a cause of any particular problem. But when you look at the brake temperatures, you'll probably notice that the rears are running abnormally cold, and the fronts, although warmer, are also probably too cool for the work that they're doing. But other than that, though, no real major issues cropped up that we found, and it's a fairly straightforward car to work with. So next up, let's get into the timeline from start to finish of how we got to where we are now with this setup. So into the timeline then, as ever, to kick off, I spent some time literally just driving the car with the default setup. The long runs showed that the rear tyre wear was generally higher than the fronts, and this matched with what felt like a general lack of rear traction, and it started to show even on shorter runs. So basically, in some ways it was good with that it showed on shorter runs, because it meant I could start my work with doing shorter runs to help try and improve the stability of the car. and get the stability that I was looking for, and then I could then fine tune. Once I got that stability, I could then fine tune for the longer run tyre wear, and that seemed to work quite nicely. So the lack of traction also felt more like it was suspension related, more so than diff related to me. So that was my main early focus as well. So I tried adjusting various different things in different directions to see and gauge how the car reacted. Now it's one of those things where it is rare where you just go bang 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 and you choose the right path every time. Sometimes it's nice just to move something that way, see what it does, move it the other way, see what it does. Okay, truth somewhere in the middle, you know. And there's a fair bit of that goes on. Well, certainly in my process anyway. It's not, there is logic to it, but sometimes you just try the opposite of what you think, just to be sure. So there was a number of experiments, and once I'd done them, I had a direction that I wanted to follow, and I visited various circuits doing that under various conditions, racing 20-30 minute stints, and after a while settled on what became version 1.4, and that had been developed now to a point where it was ready for a full validation runs and checking. So, and I'd also reached that point where I'd sort of got a little bit blind to it as well. So I got to that point with the G40 in the previous video. So again, sent it off to Marc and to Peter to get their view before I sunk too much more time into it, because it was getting to the point where I was in danger of starting to go further down a rabbit hole that I may or may not want to go down. So off to Marc, off to Peter to get their view on it. Now Marc came back and he was really happy with it, which is really great. He didn't really have any changes he wanted to make. And Peter was finishing up with another project separate to this. So it took him a little while to get onto it. And while I was waiting for his feedback, I thought I'd do my livery and skin for it, and then also record the Road Atlanta race, which you're seeing here as well, just to have some fun with it because it was racing so nicely. So Peter finished up his other project, and he came back with some of his own settings, independent to mine, which we'll call V1.6.8.6.3085. Now I tried those settings and I didn't feel that they were as balanced as what my setup was, but there was something about the way that Peter's setup braked. It had a really nice stability under braking, and I liked that, and I wanted to try and bring that into my setup. So I did some more testing to see what was making the difference, and used some of that to help develop what was my V1.4 setup. And once that was done, we had the hybrid version, which became version 2.0. So 2.0 now needed to be verified and finalized. So back to Peter it went. I didn't bother sending it to Marc this time. I just sent it straight back to Peter, because I knew Marc was going to like it, because it wasn't a whole lot different to 1.4. So I knew Marc was going to like it anyway. So I sent it back to Peter, and he then came back offering a couple of small adjustments, just to help make it a bit more user friendly, if not ultimately as quick. So it might be a fraction slower than than is possible now, but it was the small changes that he made to my version 2.0 were subtle, but they had quite a nice impact on the way the car drove. So that was really, really nice. And so that became version 2.1. I didn't feel the need to even modify it at that point, because it felt like it was a more user-friendly car, and it felt like it would be better received by more people, by a more rounded number of people. So it felt like it was the right decision to make, was to keep that in place. So its main gain, actually, so 2.1, its main gain was drivability. It wasn't just, it was more stable at the apex where the rear of the car was lightest. As you were just coming off the brakes, it felt a bit more stable there, and it also was a lot more stable if you went over curb usage. It was able to accept the use of curbs better, and it had a slightly better and more user-friendly power sort of traction zone area. It was just the rear of the car just felt a bit more planted, but I think where if you wanted it to be a bit sharper, you could get a bit more speed out of it. It was one of those sort of things, but we'll get into that shortly. So what we've got here is version 2.1, and version 2.1 overall has seen Alton Park International, Silverstone National, Campo Grande, Snetterton 300, Road Atlanta, as you can see, Kyle Army, which was the video after this one. Now Kyle Army was done with version 2.0, and since then we've had 2.1, and also to the Cavello short circuit. Now a mixture of those have also been wet and dry, and I'm pleased to report that in the wet, with very few changes, the car can be made really nice, and even with using the dry 2.1 setup, it's still completely drivable in the wet conditions. So another good indication that where we are is a really good place for the car. So without further ado, let's get into the setup itself and see how it compares to the default. As ever, let's start with tyres, brakes and chassis. The tyre pressures were reduced from 1.80 bar front and rear from the default setup down to 1.60 bar. Once again, we've just seen that the lower pressures just seem to perform better, even on the longer runs. Peter preferred them to be just a little bit higher again, 0.05 or so extra, and a little bit extra in the rear compared to the front for Peter. And that's really just so that by the time they get warm, our pressures are about the same, but because I put more energy into my tyres, my starting pressure has to be a little bit lower, so that by the time they get warm, they're about the same. The brake pressure went from 90% down to 82%. We have got ABS on this car, and it's very effective, but even so, 82% just gave us a slightly nicer ability to modulate and get the pressure that we wanted to help prevent basically too harsh a braking. Really, you just gave you a better control of how you got the car slowed down. The brake bias went forwards a bit, from 62% on the front to 65% on the front, so about 3%, which is not a small amount, but we just used that to help keep the car nicer balanced as you were getting in towards the apex of the corner. It didn't seem to really make the front suffer by moving it forwards, but the rear certainly seemed a bit happier that way. The rear downforce stayed at 2. So that's tyres, brakes and chassis. Not much more to report there, is there? So let's now get into the suspension, shall we? Into the suspension, we kept the caster angle at 6 degrees. The front camber was reduced from -4.2 degrees down to -3.7 degrees. The ride height was reduced from 115 down to 112. The front spring was increased from number 6 up to number 9. The front bump was increased from 11 to 16. The front rebound was increased from 11 to 14. So we've actually increased the bump more than the rebound there on the front, just to help try and encourage weight to the rear of the car, really, with the lesser rebound essentially. Just helps the front of the car lift up a little bit quicker, a little bit easier, which then sends a bit more weight to the rear of the car. The rear camber was increased from -2.0 down to -2.2, so we've actually got more negative camber. The rear ride height was reduced from 141mm down to 137. The rear spring was increased from 6 to 7. So although we've increased the rear spring rate, we've increased the front by a bigger margin. So we've gone from 6 to 9 on the front, and we've gone from 6 to 7 on the rear. So really, overall, we've increased the front more than we have the rear, which helps the rear out. The rear bump has been increased from 8 to 13, and the rear rebound has been increased from 10 to 13. And we actually felt that the rear damping was too free moving. It wasn't stiff enough. It just felt better when you ran it a bit stiffer. Like the rear of the car wasn't moving as much. Right, the steering lock was reduced from 26 down to 21. It felt like it was far too easy to overdo your steering angle. So, and it felt like your steering input was ahead of the car in some ways. So reducing that just meant that your input on the wheel felt more in tune with what you were seeing from the car. And I've explained this before, but I should explain it again. So with the steering lock value, if you increase the value, it means that your input of the steering wheel, so for every degree you move the steering wheel, you have a larger physical movement of the wheels turning in their lock. And if you reduce the value of the steering lock, it means that you have to move your steering wheel more to get the same amount of steering lock from the actual wheels themselves. And if you reduce it, it just means that you essentially slow down your steering. And if you feel like the car is behind your steering input, then you can increase it. If you feel like the car is ahead of your steering input, i.e. you can turn it too far, and you get a feeling like it's over-centered if you got it too high. So you turn the wheel and it feels like it instantly goes into understeer, like the front tyres just can't cope with that much movement that quickly, and it over-centers and the wheel goes a little bit lighter. Then you'll find that, generally speaking, you've got your steering lock a little bit on the high side, most likely, and you can just reduce that down. And when you get it right, basically the car feels like it's moving correctly with the steering wheel. Now, the front toe angle was, depending on your view of it, so it went from minus 0.3 degrees, which is toe out, where if you look at the car, they're doing that, with the front of the car going that way. So they've gone from minus 0.3 degrees toe out to dead ahead 0.0. It just helps to keep the car. So oddly, actually, so it feels like the toe in angle, if you run toe out on the toe angle, it's almost like you've increased the caster. It's got a similar effect to a caster increase. And it's an odd one, and it feels like it sort of makes the inside rear wheel a little bit light. It feels like it's sort of like lifting the inside wheel when you turn the steering wheel, like a jacking effect, if you like, a bit like a go-kart. So reducing that just helped that inside rear wheel stay down and stay planted, which meant that when you're trying to get on the throttle and you've still got a little bit of lock applied, it just means that inside rear wheel felt like it was better weighted and could cope with a bit of throttle. Whereas if with the toe out on the car, the inside wheel felt a bit lighter, and when you got on the throttle, it then started to spin up and didn't like it very much. And that just helped even that out a little bit. The rear toe-in angle went from 0.3 degrees toe in, which is where they're pointing inwards with the front of the car going that way. That's like a top-down view, like a plan view of the car. So they went from 0.3 degrees toe in to 0.4 degrees, so that means that basically they're towing in a little bit extra. And the rear anti-roll bar went from 9 down to 2. Oh, did I bypass the front roll bar? I did, didn't I? So the front roll bar went from 10 down to 3, and the rear roll bar went from 9 down to 2. I mean, the rear roll bar certainly helped with traction, 100%, no doubt about that. Yeah, it was far better with the lower rear roll bar, and the front roll bar was done to try and get the balance back. So we increased the front spring, but we got the roll stiffness. So the extra roll stiffness that the front spring gave us which we didn't necessarily want, we then got rid of by reducing the front anti-roll bar. Right, so that's the suspension, and so let's get into the drivetrain now. The drivetrain, fuel, we've got 44 litres, default's 27, but 44 will see you good for a good half an hour race. Anti-lock brakes were reduced from 8 down to 5. The final drive has stayed as 4.531, but that is something that you are going to change if you want to get the most out of the car. So a larger number means that you have a lower top speed but a faster 0 to 60 acceleration time. A smaller number means you've got a higher top speed but a slower 0 to 60 time. So on a smaller circuit you want a bigger number, on a larger circuit you want a smaller number, and that is something that you will probably need to play with. And when you're doing that, what you're looking to do is on the longest straight where the car is at its fastest top speed, you want it to ideally just be starting to show the shift light at the very end before you then have to get on the brakes. Now, if you're on a circuit where slipstreaming is really important, you might want to go just a little bit, so a slightly smaller number again, just to give you a bit of extra leeway to gain speed if it's a car you can slipstream with. Yeah, that's what you're looking for. Basically, just try and get it so that with the fastest part of the circuit, top gear, the shift light just starts to flicker as you're getting towards the braking zone of the next corner. Onto the diff. We didn't actually change much on the diff. All we did, so the clutches stayed at 6 and the preload was increased from 90 newton meters up to 155, and that 155 newton meters really helped stabilize the car on entry to the corners. Mainly that was its main purpose. So there are a number of things you may or may not wish to change should you drive the car and maybe think, oh, I wish it did this or that. So let's get into those changes now, and also what changes you might want to make for certain conditions as well. Right, let's get into it. So the first key change from the drivetrain section really is the final drive, and as I say, you want to tune that final drive. You want to leave first, second, third, fourth and fifth gears, really. I wouldn't change those, but you want the final drive to really show the shift light as you reach the fastest point of the circuit, as I just explained. Another real key feature is the brake balance. You will probably want to play with that a little bit depending on the circuit. It's quite a critical setup choice, but if you're finding that the front of the car is struggling to get into the apex, you might want to just bring it back a little bit. If you find that the rear of the car is a little bit squirrely going into the apex, you might want to move it forwards a click or so. You don't want much more than say 2% either direction. If you're going more than that, you're probably looking in the wrong place. The brake pressure will be a very personal thing, and you may want to consider, so if you're at Bathurst, for example, where you've got the big stop at the chase, you may find you need to increase that brake pressure to a higher number in order so that you don't get rammed up the backside under a real heavy braking zone. But where your focus is mainly on modulation, you might want to consider moving it to around about where it is there. The front anti-roll bar is a very, very powerful change, and so is the rear roll bar as well. So if you want to smooth out the front end of the car a little bit, you can increase it. If you want to make it a bit more aggressive on the front, you can reduce it. Rear anti-roll bar, if you want just a bit more traction, or if you're on a circuit, say like the last corner at Cavello, where you've got a really high banked or a fairly high level of banking on a short circuit, sorry, on a short turn, and you're trying to get on the throttle as early as you can, and the inside rear wheels sort of in a bit of a dip, you might find that reducing the rear anti-roll bar to its minimum is probably favourable, because then the outside wheel isn't trying to sort of lift that inside wheel up, and it's allowing, if you reduce it, it's allowing that rear wheel, just that inside wheel, just to drop a bit more freely into the tarmac. And that's a very helpful change. And because the rear of the car is such a critical part of this whole picture, you really want to make sure that that's nailed, really. The front spring is also a very powerful change. Now, if you reduce the front spring, you might benefit as well from increasing the front roll bar a little bit. So there's this thing called roll stiffness. So you can get roll stiffness by spring rate or anti-roll bars, or sorry, the combination of the two. So if you have no anti-roll bar, then all your roll stiffness, basically the thing which is resisting roll in the car, is coming from the main springs. If you add an anti-roll bar to that, then you might want to lower the front spring a little bit. So there's a combination there between using a heavier front spring in order to prevent the front of the car from dipping too much under braking. So you want enough, so you use the front springs to really get the braking stability, really, and then the anti-roll bar is then used to get the way the car feels when you're in that sort of mid-corner area, mainly. But yeah, you use the two in combination with each other, and if you've got a car that's already about right, you'll generally find that if you reduce the front spring, you probably need to increase the front roll bar a little bit. Not by much, only 1 or 2 clicks at the most per spring. But yeah, it's one of those ones where you just have to play with it. But they are related to each other, so just bear that in mind. If you change one, you may need to change the other. What else do we change? Yes. So and the rear spring as well. The rear spring, again, if you want a bit more traction, you can run it a little bit softer at the back. If you want a bit more stability, but if you feel like the car is too locked in at the back, you can increase the rear spring or increase the rear anti-roll bar if you want to. The rear damping, especially the rear bump, is also very critical. You can, if you want a bit more stability at the back, you can reduce the rear bump damping a little bit, and that just allows the rear of the car to squat a little bit sooner, a little bit easier with the weight transfer, which then encourages the rear to sit in to the geometries and help you get out of the corner. You can go too far with it, so just bear that in mind. And they're really the main changes. I mean, things like the towing angle, if you want it a bit more stable, you could increase the rear towing angle and that sort of stuff, but they're sort of they've seemed sort of secondary changes to us, really. It's not really the sort of thing that you would expect to change or feel the need to change. I wouldn't have thought, but it's there if you need it. Now, if you're running in wet conditions, you can just run this setup as is, and you'll probably be absolutely fine. You can drive it perfectly fine. If you're in a wet dry race, I would definitely suggest doing that. If you're in a purely wet race, you may want to consider reducing the clutches down to 4. Now that's an optional thing, and I would only do that if the other changes that I'm about to suggest don't give you what you need. So run that as a backup option at the end, but before you do that, try reducing the rear spring 1 or 2 clicks, and try reducing the rear damping 3 or 4 clicks, and that should help you out. And if it's possibly also reduce the rear roll bar as well, because traction is key at that point. So try reducing the rear spring, try reducing the rear damping, and try reducing the rear roll bar. And if those 3 things don't give you what you need, I would then try reducing the clutches from 6 down to 4. And if that doesn't work, then give it a bit of extra towing angle. But I would imagine in the wet, what you're looking for is going to be more stability at the rear and traction, essentially. If in the wet you find that you've got the rear is too locked in on the throttle, I'll be very surprised. Yeah, so that is pretty much it for this car. So what's next? Next up, it's the E30's bigger brother, the E46 GTR. I was in two minds about doing this car next, but I'm really keen, and so is Peter, to see how it differs from the E30 Group A. It's a couple of generations between the two, and they're different classes of car, but I'm I'm really hopeful that I'll get a similar experience out of this E46 version compared to what I did out of the E30 from the Group A class. It's going to be a very interesting couple of weeks. I hope it's as good as what I've had from the Group A car. And I'm really sorry to put the Group A car away, but I will be coming back to it. It's been absolutely brilliant fun. I've loved every minute of driving it. And yeah, I'm looking forward to being able to come back and revisit and have some more fun with it. So until the next video, which could be a race with the E46 GTR, it could be the setup video itself. I'm not sure yet. It depends on how much fun I have with it, I guess. I will leave you with the setup sheets for the E30 Group A car, both in units and in rates. But yeah, until the next video, thank you for watching, thank you for supporting, and until the next time, we'll see you later.